our group time today is going to be pretty short. We are going to just talk about Shakespeare today. We are going to read about some of the other things that he's done, and where he was from. We can read another story.
I hope it's
but we won't read it today. We will read another Shakespeare story next week.
Can you read Macbeth?
Sure. We can do Macbeth. Okay, so we're just going to kind of go through and learn some history about actually William Shakespeare and where he was from. We read about, who remembers about how long ago he lived?
500 years.
Close.
400.
400 years, about 400 years ago. So we're going way back in history. Now tell me this. Did he make movies and people would go to the movie theaters?
There was no television then.
There was no television. So how did he perform? Plays and on the stage. Were women usually involved in his plays?
No, it's just men dressing up as women.
Men dressing up as women, and who, a lot of times, who would be a good candidate to be a woman?
Him.
Young boys.
No.
Who hadn't hit puberty yet.
Yes.
Because, guess what? Then you don't have your beard.
No.
Your voice isn't so deep. So a lot of times the younger guys would be the women.
I'm glad I was not one. Why didn't girls usually have plays?
Because, back then women were useless. We couldn't do anything. Okay, let's listen. Shakespeare came from Stratford upon Avon, a quiet market town. Although he made his name in London, he often went back home to see his wife and 3 children. Later, he bought a big house in Stratford and eventually retired there. Now, with over 2 million visitors every year, Stratford is one of the biggest tourist attractions in Britain. The map shows what Stratford was like during Shakespeare's lifetime. So, when we're done with this book, I'll leave it out and you guys can look at it more closely. So this is just kind of a map. Remember, it's a small little market town, so it's not a big thriving city like London is. And even though he did most of his work in London, where most of the people were, this was his hometown, and this is where his wife lived. And how many kids did he have? 3 kids. So this is kind of a map of what it would have looked like while he was living. And then it shows the road to London. So he would have to cross the bridge. They've got a little picture of Shakespeare's School, which is still standing. So if you ever get the chance to go to Britain, try to make time to visit Stratford, and you can visit some of the historical points from Shakespeare's life. Yes, Elliot?
Where did he live in his childhood, adulthood, and was he British?
Yes, and Stratford and London.
Okay. Did they have to fix up the school, or is it just?
I'm sure they've had to do some rejuvenation and renovation. It's pretty much the same. They have to fix older things. They have to fix up, but they try to keep. Yeah, so like if there's a beam that's rotted, they might replace that beam, but they do their best to keep it looking the same as it did.
And try to get put in new light and stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure it's all done up with electricity.
Maybe they put they're saying desks. Back then, did they use torches and stuff to light up the halls and stuff?
Mm-hmm. So the school is called King Edward VI Grammar School. Boys usually only went to school if their parents could afford not to send them to work. So when Shakespeare was alive, we know that it took many years before people found it necessary for girls to go to school. And usually girls would go to school only until 2nd grade, and then they would stay home and help their mom take care of the house and things like that. Boys would go to school a little bit longer, and then if their families could afford for them to go to college or things like that, then they would. If they had a poorer family, then they would learn a trade, become an apprentice, and start working, usually around 15. So at they usually didn't learn how to read or write. So there's one reason that girls were not frequently actors in plays, because can they read the script? No. At school, boys studied mostly Latin. One schoolmaster taught a class of about 12 boys, sometimes with the help of an assistant. Shakespeare left when he was about 15 and started work. He didn't go to a university, but probably read what books he could get a hold of in his spare time. So, did Shakespeare have a college education? No. A hasty marriage. Raise your hand if you know the name of William Shakespeare's wife.
Mary.
Nope.
Harry.
Shakespeare's wife.
Nope.
No, not
Her name was Anne Hathaway.
Anne?
Anne Hathaway, not to be confused with the famous actress today named Anne Hathaway. So Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway in 1582 when he was 18. She was 8 years older than him and already pregnant. In those days, as now, it wasn't unusual for women to be pregnant at their wedding. But it was acceptable. It was socially acceptable as long as the girl was married before the baby was born.
Why is it acceptable?
It was only acceptable if she got married to the father before the baby was born.
Why?
We're not going to go into details about that because y'all are too little.
Yeah.
Shakespeare bought a large, expensive Stratford house, new place, in 1597. This was quite early in his career. He was still working in London most of the time, but it gave his wife and children their own home and proved to everyone that Shakespeare had paid off his family's debts. At the end of his career, Shakespeare retired to Stratford and lived at New Place until he died in 1616.
No way.
After marrying Anne, Shakespeare probably worked with his father in Stratford, although he might have been a teacher, a lawyer, or a soldier. What we do know is that by 1592, he was in London writing plays. He may have left for London with actors who were visiting Stratford with touring theater companies who could have helped him find a job in the theater. So we don't really know what he did before he became a famous playwright. We do know that he was from Stratford. We do know he married Anne Hathaway at age 18. We do know he worked for his father. We don't really know what they did. And we don't really know how he moved to London to become a playwright. At the time, there were companies of actors called troupes of actors, and they would travel around performing. So the one theory is that he met up with a troupe of actors, and he went with them to London.
Was Juliet a boy?
Originally.
Lee would be a perfect Juliet.
Yeah, he would.
I would not make a perfect Juliet.
Yes, you would.
So at the time when Shakespeare was alive, we call it Elizabethan England. Why do you think it might be called Elizabethan? Because who might the queen have been? Queen Elizabeth. So we call it Elizabethan England. Life in Elizabethan England could be cruel and hard. The poor often went hungry. Disease was widespread. Medical remedies often felt more like tortures, and many women died in childbirth. But through their beliefs, people found ways of making sense of their existence. So some of the ways, and some of this is reflected in some of Shakespeare's work, some of their medical beliefs and things were very different from ours. Let's see if it talks about any of that. So we know, and we know this from like our Salem witch trials, they believed in witchcraft. They believed that there were witches. A lot of diseases would be blamed on witches, just like in our Salem witch trials. So if there was, like for example, we have our pandemic, right? We've got a pandemic going on. If we were in Elizabethan England, they probably would have blamed this whole pandemic on witches. Witches were casting spells and cursing people with this virus.
How do they know that they're witches? How do they know who's witches?
People weren't saying 400 years ago.
I know. They're very insane.
Oh, I've seen the movie.
They also had just kind of different beliefs. The human body was thought to be a miniature representation of the universe as a whole. Various parts of the body were linked to the planets and signs of the zodiac. Things that happened in the universe, which was known as macrocosm, were supposed to happen on a much smaller scale within the human body, or the microcosm. The body was also thought to contain 4 humors, or fluids: black bile, phlegm, blood, and choler. A person's temperament depended on the way the humors were mixed. For example, in Julius Caesar, one of his histories, Mark Antony describes Brutus as a man in whom all these humors are mixed perfectly. So that would mean his body is in perfect balance.
Miss Megan,
But most people were thought to have one humor that was more dominant than the other.
and on the back, look.
So, for example, illnesses and mental disorders like depression were blamed on one of those 4 humors being off kilter and not being accurate.
Cats were also blamed for witchcraft too.
Yeah.
Aw, poor
That's
kitties.
insane. Poor cat.
By the early 1590s, Shakespeare had arrived in London, England's capital city. It was a thriving port with an expanding population. His first impressions would have been of teeming crowds, the squalor of poverty, and the extravagance of the wealthy. Although none of Shakespeare's plays is set wholly in London, the city must have been a great influence on him. He would have attended lectures on new scientific discoveries, discussed the latest trends in playwriting, listened to tales of foreign lands from merchants, and enjoyed the lively nightlife. So one of the things that happens is the plague. The plague is kind of like what we've got right now, only much worse. Crowded conditions and poor situation made London an ideal breeding ground for plague, a fatal disease carried by fleas on rats.
Yikes.
So during Shakespeare's life, the plague was a thing. We now call it the Black
Is that where he
Plague.
died from?
No, I don't think so. All right, one thing we need to talk about in Elizabethan England, and especially in London, they had a caste system. So today, we have a democracy, and we have different classes of people which are kind of based on how much money they make. Now that's up to the people, right? So like, no matter how you grew up, you can choose to pursue your dreams and go to college and become a doctor or whatever you want to do. Or you could grow up in a very wealthy family and choose to leave all that behind you and be a wanderer, right? We can choose to be whatever we want to, and we all have equal rights, yes? Okay, in Elizabethan England, that wasn't the case. If you were wealthy, you had all the rights and freedoms. If you were a peasant would be like very poor. You were not treated very well, and you weren't allowed to do all the same things. So that also kind of goes with the theater. They had seats for the wealthy. The peasants had to stand and watch. So it just kind of, your class in life definitely affected your overall experience. So we're just going to kind of fly through this really quick. So we have professional troops of actors, like we talked about. The first London theater was called The Theater. It was built in 1576 in North London, just outside the city walls. In 1587, the Rose Theater was built south of the Thames among the prisons of an area called Bankside. The Rose flourished and drew large crowds. In 1595, the huge Swan Theater, said to hold up to 3,000 people, was built just a few yards to the west. All these theaters were deliberately built outside the city limits, so they were free from the restrictions of city regulations. So eventually, William Shakespeare builds a very famous theater called the Globe. The Globe Theater. It was built in 1599, and from the time it was built until the end, that's where all of Shakespeare's plays were performed. The theater could hold 3,000 people, and there were 2 performances a day. Along with other members of his theater company, the Chamberlain's Men, Shakespeare owned a share of the Globe and made a lot of money from it. So his troupe of actors was called the Chamberlain's Men. Okay, and then eventually in 1970, the Globe Theater was rebuilt. So I believe you can still go visit it today.
Today? Does it still look like it? Or
Probably not.
probably?
Yeah, I'm sure they rebuilt it to how it would have originally looked. It's still one of London's biggest theaters, but because of safety restrictions, it can only hold half as many people as the original.
Why?
Who did they even
For safety reasons.
How did they even build
Just
it?
in case it collapses.
We talked about this. We've got the tragedies, the great tragedies.
Ooh, I like tragedies.
You don't even know what it means. What is it?
The Roman tragedies. The comedies.
Romeo and Juliet was a comedy, right?
The problem plays. The romances.
No, not romance, not romance.
Earlier history plays. Later history plays. Poems and songs.
Yeah.
So we read a sonnet already. A sonnet, remember, is a love poem. I think we will save.
Camden.
We still have a little more time. Shakespeare's use of language made him one of the greatest writers in the world. With extraordinary skill and poetic imagination, he could set vivid scenes, express powerful emotions, and reveal character in highly original ways. Many of his phrases have become part of our everyday language. Writers often use literary devices or special ways of using words. These devices can help to express complex ideas, emphasize what is being said, or describe something in a memorable or exciting way. One of the main devices Shakespeare uses is imagery, or using images, or figures of speech to describe things. For example, Hamlet uses the phrase, "a sea of troubles," to describe his problems. This image makes us think of the sea, and we can imagine Hamlet's problems surging towards him like a tide or swallowing him up like a sinking ship. Metaphors and similes are 2 types of imagery. Who remembers the difference in a metaphor and a simile? They're both things to compare. Elliot?
Are you still recording?
What was that?
A simile uses like or as, and a metaphor
It's a metaphor.
uses is. Luke is a bear in the morning.
Isn't it?
Is Luke actually a bear when he wakes up from
Yes.
bedtime?
Yes.
Does he grow fur and claws and turn
No.
into a
Yes.
grizzly bear?
Yes.
But maybe he's a little bit grouchy. I might say, I could say Lee is like a jester. A jester likes to make
What about
people
me?
laugh.
Were you gonna say something to me?
I could say Lake is
The exact opposite.
like a goose. He's like a silly, silly goose. So a simile uses like or as, and a metaphor doesn't.
What am I?
Of course, it would be cool though.
Elijah could be a moose.
Ooh, issues in
Susanna could be a
Shakespeare.
papoose. And can be a rabbit. A white fluffy rabbit.
Wait.
Alvin the chipmunk. Yeah.
My pillow is.
I'm not the teacher.
Shakespeare talks about a lot of topics that are still issues today. So one example of that is that there are issues with different races. So we talk about people having different colored skin tone. For example, in Othello, Othello has an not African American because they were in Britain, but a man of color with a white lady. And so now they're also talking about things that were issues in Elizabethan times, like the role of women. You know, women were expected to be married by a certain age. Women were expected to do the housekeeping and do all those things. And so you'll find some things about that, like in the Taming of the Shrew. He also has social and moral messages. But one thing, this will be interesting because this is something, and too bad Imogen's not here because she would definitely want to hear about this part. Maybe she'll watch. Was Shakespeare feminist? What does feminist mean? Feminist means that you are like power to the women and that kind of thing. So like fighting for women's rights. I don't know, help me out, Miss Jen. Explain feminism. Women being rebellious, getting out of their stereotypes, doing things that are traditionally men's roles. Things like that.
Like men.
Yes. Many of Shakespeare's female characters are intelligent and strong-willed. Is that something that was common 400 years ago? No. They seem freer and more independent than most women of his time were. Rosalind, the heroine of As You Like It, disguises herself as a boy, escapes from her power-crazed uncle, survives in the forest, and finds her love again. Portia, in The Merchant of Venice, provides a brilliantly clever solution to an apparently insoluble problem. Cleopatra, in Antony and Cleopatra, is an Egyptian queen whose powerful personality threatens the leadership of Rome. Even so, most of Shakespeare's heroines are shown in relation to men and find happiness through husbands. For Rosalind, a happy ending means engagement to Orlando. Portia uses her intelligence to save her husband's friend before settling down to become a wife. And Cleopatra kills herself when her beloved Antony dies. As does who?
Juliet.
Shakespeare wrote about the kinds of women that the women in his audience liked to watch. His female characters were varied and exciting, which also helps to make the plays exciting. But he also reflected Elizabethan values in showing love and marriage to be the main focus of women's lives. So I would say he was not a feminist. I would say, so he's reflecting what is true and accurate for the time, but he is also giving the ladies in the audience what they want to see. So the ladies of the audience, you know, maybe they can identify with these characters. Maybe they wish they could do something brave and rebellious like them, right? So it's definitely more entertaining, and the plays are definitely more fun than if the women all just minded their manners and did as they were told. Can you imagine girls
I can imagine.
having to just do as you were told and clean the house all day?
Yes. I hate cleaning house on Saturday.
I would never have made it.
But you still do. I hate cleaning the house. My mom does. I'll probably fall into a bit.
Miss Megan, my name is Chicken Nugget. My name's Chicken Nugget.
Okay, in the back of this book, they have listed Shakespeare's plays, and it gives you a little summary of what the plot is. So if you think you would like to read some more Shakespeare, but you're not sure what you would want to read, this would be a good place to just kind of browse some of his works and decide what you might want to read. And before we end, I'm going to try to find.
What's the one with the donkey again? The play with the donkey head that we did, and Max was the donkey person. We did like when we did the play. His play that we did like I think we did a mix of like Shushet and I forget what the other play was.
Let's see. Let's find a good William Shakespeare poem to end our group time with. This one's mouthful.
For goodness sake. Shakespeare once said, for goodness sake. Will you shut up? That's what he probably said. For goodness sake, shut up. Please. For goodness sake, shut up.
I guess we will read Sonnet 116. Sonnet.
Sonic? No, I hate that movie.
Are we ready? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters when its alteration finds, or bends with the remover of to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within its bending sickle's compass come. Love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. What does that mean?
Don't know.
It means love never changes, true love never changes, true love never ends. And then he says in the end that should he be wrong, he never wrote, and nobody has ever really loved.
Yes.
So true love defies all struggles. True love is there till the end.
Now, what if they break
Those of you saying no have never felt true love before.
Well, what if they say I'm breaking up with you?
Doesn't mean you don't love them. Or maybe it wasn't true love. You can feel, and you guys will go through this. You guys, one day, you're going to feel like you're in love with somebody. When you're bigger, you're going to feel like, just like Romeo with Rosalind.
No.
Oh, he loved her so much.
No.
Whoa, she's the only one for me. How can I live without her? But then what happens? He meets Juliet. He meets Juliet, and he's like, oh, that wasn't true love. This is true love. And when you guys find it, you will know the difference. And one day, when you are old, you're going to stop and you're going to look at your wife or your husband or your child, and you're going to say, this is true love. And then you're going to be like, Miss Megan was right again.
I would rather jump in the ocean.
We're a piece of dirt.